So welcome to another edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. He is the legendino, Tim Vickery. He is still in sunny Rio as the weather turns over here, so he's going to get envious of us as he starts approaching autumn.
And he is the night owl, Dotun Adebayo, although if you wind him up enough, he'll go for his little flights at other times during the day as well. And today we're going back to a time when there was a song called Night Owl in the charts.
Yes, and we're going back to a time when I was a student at Stockholm University. That's going to become significant in a moment or two. But first,
were you already in Sweden in May 79?
Yeah, I was already.
Wow.
I was at college, mate. I was 19. What do you want me to do?
Uh-huh.
Ready? When did you think I was in Sweden? Out of interest.
I thought it was kind of early 80s. I didn't realise you were there. You were there so early.
Well,
I didn't realise you were there
in the early 80s. Yeah.
When Dotun was just about to explode in England. So you
Funny
missed
enough,
all of that.
No, I didn't miss all of that, because remember what happens in England when England catches a cold, Sweden sneezes. Remember that. Just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind for this conversation.
Well, that's clearly of relevance to the football, I think.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it is, yeah. Bob Houghton, not least. Well, he caught a cold and look what happened to him. But let's introduce somebody that it is a real pleasure to welcome him onto the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, because he's an actor, he's a director, he's produced an amazing documentary, actually, that I've seen and I'll talk about in a moment or two. He's a broadcaster and he's also senior official at Nottingham Forest. Johnny Owen, welcome.
It's very nice to be here, lads. Very nice to be here.
It really is a privilege. We're talking about May the 9th, 1979, is it?
No, it's a bit later.
Sorry, May the 30th, apologies. So we're talking about May the 30th, 1979. Momentous.
It's big for me because I just turned 14 on the 25th. So that's...
You're only 14?
Yeah, that's a landmark in a young man's life, turning 14, I think.
Remember, I'm a prefect, so you just hold your own counsel to you're spoken to. Snivelling gits that 14-year-old third years or fourth years. Mind your own business, okay? And don't come into the common room, whatever you do, because me and Johnny are talking. Johnny, honestly, it is arguably the most momentous day in Nottingham Forest's entire history, although it has competition. What would Nottingham Forest fans say? Was it this European Cup victory that was the most profound for them, or was it the other one?
I think it was the first one, in my opinion, and most of the Forest fans I speak to, I think it was the first one, because obviously the journey where they'd been promoted, won the old First Division, and then won the European Cup the following year. That kind of like hat trick of things, really. I mean, the second year was phenomenal as well. I think they broke Real Madrid's record by the second year for the longest streak of not losing in a European Cup in over a series of years. So it was remarkable what they did. But I believe, my opinion would be that the first year was the most momentous.
And Tim, would you agree?
P.P. Arnold. First cut is the deepest. It is such an unbelievable journey. You know, a team that 5 years earlier were kind of trundling along mid-table in the old school second division. You know, to do what they did is unbelievable. And the second one in 1980, the year later, was against much better opponents than the group of farmers who took them on in 79. But I think the first one, the Forest fans, they must have been absolutely unable to believe, because if you go just a few years earlier, the European Cup, as the Champions League was then known, it was like unattainable for the biggest English clubs. You know, United had won it in '68, but you know, not until Liverpool in 77 did we have any other winners. So if you go back to, say, 75, when Forest are in the second division, and at that time, and Leeds got to the final that year in the European Cup, but at that time, the European Cup seems unattainable even for the biggest clubs in the land. Imagine for Nottingham Forest, and 4 years later, there they are receiving a trophy. It is an amazing story.
Absolute bonkers.
There's a great story that a fan said to me. His name is Andy Hallam. He's a great lad. And he said to me, this is genuinely true. He said he remembers going to Carlisle with Forest, I think at about 75, And he said, I could see between the stands some Highland cattle, you know, those big shaggy sort of things with the horns. And he said to me, within 5 years, I was in the Bernabeu, in the most famous stadium probably in the world, at the biggest club in the world, you'd say at the time, at Real Madrid, watching us win a European Cup. He said, that was the trajectory of the journey that I went on. It's a remarkable thing. And there's so many stories about people like getting passports for the first time, going abroad for the first time, you know, because Clough had come into Nottingham, and the profound effect he had on that city and people's lives is a remarkable thing. And like I said, that's the power of football and what can happen, where, like I said, you can go from going to Carlisle to go into the new camp, you know, when they won the Super Cup and things like that within a few seasons. And I think it's probably the most remarkable story in the history of sport, let alone football, of a team's trajectory and a rise like that. It's never happened before that. It'll probably never happen again. It's the most incredible thing.
And look at some of the people who went along on the journey. I mean, John Robertson is the big hero, isn't it? He's the man who, with his left foot, makes the goal in '79. Yeah. With his right foot, he scores the goal in 1980. And when Clough turns up at Forest, you know, he's just this fat little drunkard with a fag hanging out of his mouth. You know? and he goes along. He's like someone who's just come out of a comic strip, you know, a tapper of the track, you know, training on fish and chips and so on, you know. And he goes along all the way along the journey. And then there's the pieces that Clough adds along the way. When Clough's philosophy was very, very much goalkeepers, centre halves, centre forwards. Yeah, you know, and you know, obviously Peter Shilton was a huge part of the jigsaw. In front of him, Larry Lloyd. They got in Larry Lloyd, and Larry Lloyd has got the turning circle of the Imoko Cadiz. He was all washed up. You can't have Larry Lloyd. He made Larry Lloyd into a European Cup winner.
Yeah, he did. I mean, what Robertson. I'm lucky enough to know John quite well now, and he's full of these great little stories about stuff, and a very, very astute footballing brain, as you said. And it's almost like the bit in Rocky, you know, in Rocky 2, where he's kind of lost his mojo, and she leans in, Adrian, doesn't she? And she famously says to him, "Win," and the music starts, you know, do 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 do, and he's on his journey. You're like, "Go on, Rocky!" And a similar thing happened to John Robertson. He's over with Forest on a pre-season training thing, and like you're saying, he's overweight, he's not training, and he actually does the story of how he warms up, and it's literally, you know, the classic thing, his hands down his shorts, little kick of each leg, and all the other players are sprinting, and Robbo, and Clough says to him, and Peter Taylor, F off, and he looks at him and he goes, yeah, go on, F off, get back to the hotel. And he said, like a little kid, he walks off to the hotel, and he says, oh, well, I think they're going to come in, and they're obviously going to say, you're on the transfer list, you're gone. So he said, they give me this massive dressing down. You're a disgrace, your diet's terrible, you know, you don't listen, blah, blah, blah. And he said, literally, like a Hollywood film, they stand up and they go, but we think you can play. And he said, I look at him, and Clough leans in and goes, I think you could be the best player I've ever had. And he'll walk away. And he said, I was never out of the team 5 years after that, never missed a game. And he won 2 European Cups. And I was thinking, that's where, if I was making the film, the Rocky music would kick in. We think you can play. John Robertson's away then, you know. He's got his player. But like the whole journey of it is full of stories like that. And once you start really getting into the sort of the meat of it, you really understand that Clough was a genius. They got Brian Clough. I think he was 39 when he went there. And those 5 years, they got that man absolutely at the zenith of his powers. He'd been to Derby, he'd learned loads. He'd been to Leeds, he'd learned, you know, what not to say to big players with bigger egos. You know, he'd been to Hartlepool and driven the team bus, literally. By the time he goes to Forest, I think, and a few Nottingham boys have said this, he probably could have gone to Sheffield United, Cardiff City, you know, a few others, and done the same thing, because his brain at that point, footballing-wise, was phenomenal.
As long as he had Peter Taylor with him.
Yeah, that was it. Together, they were incredible. Their record is astonishing together. It's astonishing. They won everything. I don't know
if you can confirm a story that I heard once, because another vital piece of the jigsaw was Kenny Burns.
Yes.
Very classy Scottish player who they put into the back four.
Yeah.
But Kenny Burns had a dreadful reputation. He was a drinker, he was a gambler and so on. And I heard that Peter Taylor, before they signed him, on the quiet, followed him to the dog track to observe his behaviour at the dog track. And he came back thinking, yeah, he's all right. He likes a flutter and all that, but I think we can control him. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. And again, but a very paternal thing developed. Kenny says that great story when he goes, he always called me Kenneth. Only my mother and Cloughie called me Kenneth. And he said, I'd be on the pitch, and if I took somebody out, you know, I was on a yellow card, he'd go, Kenneth! Oh, sorry. And he brought him into line, you know. So there's those great stories about they respected Clough as well. And the alchemy of the team. I mean, there was 5 players already there in a mid-table second division team. Imagine this now, like Mourinho or somebody going into somewhere, you know, mid-table in the Huddersfield, and you go, you know, you're going to keep 5 of the team. Viv Anderson, you know, he's already there. Ian Bowyer, Martin O'Neill, John Robertson, you know, they're in the club already, and you think this is astonishing. And then he adds the right players. He brings in Peter Shilton, arguably the best goalkeeper in the world. You know, he brings in Frank Clark, who's an aging, you know, fullback from Newcastle, but brilliantly experienced. Colin Barrett from Man City's reserves. You know, he brings in John McGovern.
There's the one who never gets the credit I think he deserves.
No, I know, he's superb for them, superb. And he took him everywhere, so he must have had something, mustn't he, for Clough? Do you know what I mean?
He's the one who just makes the whole team tick over.
Yeah.
He never holds the ball for longer than it has to hold the ball, but he's always moving it. He never, ever got the credit that he deserved, John McGovern.
And John McGovern says another great story. He says to me, he used to shout from the side of the pitch to me, John, when you get hold of the ball, give it to John Robertson. That's what he used to say to him. Whenever you get time on the ball, give it to... But Clough, can I just know? Give it to John Robertson, because he can play and you can't, son. That's what he said to me.
It worked.
Yeah,
and here I am sitting and listening to all of this from the English perspective, and particularly the Nottingham Forest perspective. But we have to give a shout out to the Tractor Boys from the south of Sweden as well. And
even though they did stink the place out, the Tractor Boys.
Did they?
It was awful. It was an awful game. I can't believe
it wasn't just the Tractor Boys' fault that it was an awful game.
I suspect it was, but go on.
No, there are 2 halves in this game. The first half, absolutely dreadful. I will agree with that. We're coming on to this. Let's not forget, before you start talking about how they stank the place out, this is the greatest achievement by any Swedish club. And you, Tim, are often a fan for teams that have a cultural narrative which pinpoints them in a certain place and time in terms of their players. Every single player on that Malmo team is a local player, These are 11 players, all from Skåne, which is the region in the south of Sweden that Malmo is based at. So it's the last sort of county before you get to Denmark, or if you want to go right across the ocean to Poland or Germany, wherever it might be. They're all local boys, and from a Swedish perspective, they look at it as the greatest achievement. Nevertheless, we don't focus on the defeat. We say, lost by 1-0, and Trevor Francis got the goal, in case you're interested. But what's more interesting from a Swedish perspective is not only are they 11 players all from Skåne, they're also a team that has lost their crucial players at this point. You know, they've lost 3 of their crucial players right down the sort of centre of the pitch as well. And this is how Sport Magazine in 2009 described it, looking back on that European Cup final. They said, look, think that you're Liverpool. Remember, this is 2009 Liverpool. Think of Liverpool, and think of Liverpool having had Steven Gerrard injured. And I'm translating it off the top of my head, by the way, and that a doctor, without question, should operate on Fernando Torres so that he misses the match, and Jamie Carragher should walk around in the final, or walk around before the final to warm up in Southport, and that Javier Mascherano would be forced to come off the plane after 34 minutes to play the match after he's broken a leg or something like that. That is basically...
Tapper had broken a toe or something.
Yeah, well, that is basically the Malmo team. that I can see you smiling, Johnny. That is basically the Malmo team that have stunk out the place, in Tim's words.
They played
They're
very deep.
heroes.
They went. I mean, listen, they're massively loved in Sweden. Like you, I've spent some time in Stockholm. Fantastic cities, fantastic country. Very, very. We were talking about it earlier on. Anglophiles in Sweden, obsessed with British music, fashion, football. I went to watch Hammarby play. It was brilliant.
That's my team. That's my team right there.
Absolutely. I was blown away by it. But I was also blown away by this team they held that Malmo team in from the time, what they'd done. They were local boys. They're seen as a very working class team, Malmo, a dock city. So they were very proud of that, what they achieved. So I understood a little bit of what it meant. And I think Brian Clough said, we were aware that they were going to go on what the modern terms a low block. They were going to defend deep, and they were a very physical team. They were all big lads from a local area, and he said they were very, very difficult to break down. And I think what had happened with Forest was, Tim remember as well, they'd had one of the most famous European ties ever in the semi-final against Cologne, one of the great Cologne team that had won the double in Germany the year before. Also considered one of the great German teams ever, that late 70s side with, all those great German internationals playing for them. Schumacher in goals, and Schneider, the blonde lad, and Van Gool, the great Belgian forward. And they'd drawn 3-3 at the City Ground. And I was lucky enough to watch the game. I found the old ITV match recording, one of the best games I've ever seen, on a mucky pudding pitch. They were like two boxers that just literally went at each other.
I remember it well. It was the one time that Shilton had a mare, didn't he? Shilton had a mare.
Yeah. Shilton had a nightmare, but it was like they were battering each other. For the second game, it had tightened right up, and then Forest achieved this remarkable result, winning 1-0 in Cologne. I think it was the first time Cologne had lost at home for 3 years.
It was a result that was seen as impossible, wasn't it?
Yes. And they went there 1-0.
What did Clough do, as he did so often before big games? He took them all out on the piss.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
You relaxed them.
He did. He was a master at that kind of psychology. The German, waiters and so on in the hotel, they went out putting heavy bets on Cologne because they've seen Forest up at 2 o'clock in the morning, pissed out their heads. But he just got them right for the game.
It's a remarkable story, isn't it? But yeah, they had more than a few beers, and in fact, he said something brilliant like, "You're not allowed to leave until I finish drinking." And of course, he loved the pints, and they were like, "Oh God, we're going to be here for hours." But they played brilliantly that night, and they needed one goal. They were superb, Forest. Clough, it's interesting, Clough's record. It's such a shame that he didn't play there more, really. But in Europe, he was phenomenal. He got to a semi-final with Derby. He won 2 with Forest. Then he got to another semi-final with Forest in the UEFA Cup. His tactics were very modern in respect. He had a strong, kept the ball, loved possession, defensively strong, brilliant on the counter-attack. I mean, like Birtles and Francis were razor sharp, as were Tony Woodcock. So, they were perfect to go to somewhere like Cologne. And again, Frank Clark said to me, I felt they didn't know what to do. They only had to get to 0-0. And he said, I felt in them a nervousness after 5-10 minutes. And he said, I said half-time, they don't know what to do this lot. We'll nick a goal and then we'll shut up the shop. And that's exactly what they did. Incredible when you think about those conversations players and managers have, where they almost plan something. They can see it, I suppose, because you play football so much, but they could see the way the game was shaping up and what they needed to do to get the result, to get out and win. And a lot of people, like you said, I remember it at the time, I was about 9 years of age, but Forest were heavy favourites for the final then, and they took that expectation. And I can remember one of them saying to me, after they won the European Cup final, there was a silence in the dressing room. Imagine this now. Because they felt they hadn't entertained, because they felt the eyes of Europe were on them, and they wanted to entertain more. I mean, imagine that now. You just think, you've won the European Cup, and they're all a bit like, we could have been better, really.
Well, it wasn't much of a game, was it? But
no.
For Clough, I think it meant so much, because he'd been there with Derby. As you say, he lost in the semi-final when he was convinced they had a bent ref. And,
he did, yeah.
And there seems to be evidence, Brian Glanville and his mate did the digging into what was going on in UEFA in the early 70s. So it was an absolute quest for him to get there and do it. I think it was a bad time for European club football as a whole.
Yeah.
Italy is just about to open up its market and bring in foreign players again, but it's the 80s where Italy takes off. Spain isn't great, and Barcelona win the Cup Winners' Cup this year. But it's not really until Venables goes to Barcelona in '84 and does much more imaginatively, does some things which are a bit similar to what Bob Houghton did to Malmo. He brought a lot of English, reducing the space, pushing the line up, being hard to play against, that Malmo had done. So at that time, there wasn't a great deal of competition. Remember, there are fewer countries in Europe anyway, so there are fewer champions. And really, the big rivals of English football at this time are the Germans.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But Forest do it the hard way, because if you're looking at the field before the tournaments, there are two teams who are going to win that.
Yeah.
Liverpool and Cologne.
Yeah.
And Forest beat them both in order to win. My beef with Malmo, I fully respect the achievement and so on, but that English school that they took with Bob Houghton, and he took Roy Hodgson as well.
He did, yeah.
Sweden had followed. Previously, they'd followed a kind of German model of football with a libero influenced by Beckenbauer.
Yeah.
And if you watch Sweden in the '74 World Cup, they were great. And then the English thing just dominated, and it was that 4-4-2, lots of big players, very, very obsessed with the shape of the side. It was very, very difficult to play against, but robotic, dull as fuck, frankly. It was what I was afraid that football was becoming on a higher technical level before Guardiola. You know, the big midfielders were all kind of 6-footers and so on, and there's not a lot of imagination. There's not a lot of space for imagination in there.
Do you know?
So it made, I think, for a dull game, because Forest weren't at their best, and Malmo, admittedly, with the injuries, they didn't seem to have anything to offer. And it's almost like an indictment of European club football at the time. What on earth is this team doing in the final?
Hang on a second. I'll tell you what they're doing in the final, because they've beaten quite a few teams on their journey to the final, as you'd have to do. And they've beaten some serious competition. They beat Monaco. Against Monaco, I think they were... Was it a draw 0-0 against Monaco? Then they went to Kiev. No, they did beat. Of course, they did beat Monaco. So I can't remember all the results and everything like that. But then they beat Dynamo Kiev, and this is, remember, the Tractor Boys, as Johnny says, from an industrial town in the south of Sweden. They've gone through a lot of opposition to get there. Their first match. Let me just give you an example of this. I've got some stats on their first match against Monaco at Malmo. Do you know how many people were there? Spectators, 5,473 people. That's the crowd that this tiny little club would expect.
Was that in Sweden or in Monaco? Because Monaco don't have a lot of support. Was that in Sweden?
No, yeah, that was in Sweden. That's at the Malmo Stadium.
How can a club with 5,000 supporters get to the final of a European
exactly.
Cup?
In Monte Carlo, the crowd was 13,000, so 3 times as much in tiny little Monte Carlo. And just going back to what you were saying about the different styles, although Sweden are ostensibly a Germanic nation, certainly their language is a Germanic language, but then again, so is ours. They're probably, like Johnny said earlier, more Anglophiliacs than they are Germanophiliacs, if you like. If you go, I totally understand what happened with the English managers. It's particularly Roy Hodgson, but Bob Houghton as well. It's much easier to make yourself your thinking, your football thinking, understood to Swedes if you're English, than for Germans to go and try and impose their football tactics onto Swedes. You see that from ABBA, for example. The success, we'll come on to ABBA when we're talking about the music afterwards. So much easier for ABBA to emulate English pop groups than to, let's say, emulate German pop groups afterwards. And even till today, you look at the Swedish royal family. Well, Germans don't have a royal family, but still, they're much more aligned to the English royal family in their sort of setup and the way that they are than to any other royal family in Europe. England is actually, or Great Britain is probably the closest country in a funny way to Sweden than even Denmark, Norway, and Finland. They love, when I went to Sweden, I was at university, people would tell me, remember, I'm only 18, 19 years old. My mates are like 19 years old, and they'll tell me, oh yeah, they've been to London 20 times. I'm like, why'd you go to London? He said, nowhere else in the world that you go to. No, I mean, apart from punk and everything else like that, they used to love England. And I think what happened is that they had, in this match, they had too much respect for the £1 million signing of Trevor Francis. Remember, nobody in Sweden has ever been signed for £1 million. You're sort of suggesting that this player is the equivalent of Pele or something. So they had so much respect. So the way that they set up was just, look, whenever Nottingham Forest have got the ball, let's just all defend and then hope for a break afterwards. So they're lobbing the long ball and they almost catch Nottingham Forest out.
Yeah, they do.
The long ball. Yeah. They almost catch it. If it wasn't for Peter Shilton, the result of the game may have been very different.
But that is the way that they play anyway. It's Graham Taylor ball. You know, lines close, reduce the space, and then when you've got it, you launch it behind their back four. There's not a lot of space for flair and imagination.
Isn't that the only way a team that is much, less of a team than their opposition? Sure. Is that the only way that they have to defend? They have to bring all their men back, leave one man up front, and then hope for the best.
I'm just cursed with an excess of romanticism, obviously. But yeah, I remember Sweden from '74 and how exciting they were in that World Cup.
World Cup is different.
They were in
World
78.
Cup is different, as you know.
In '74, they were still following more the German model. It was before all of you lot went over there and anglicised them.
I did my bit for the United Kingdom, yeah, let's put it like that. But going back to Nottingham Forest, and it will be all about Nottingham Forest, of course, because this was an amazing achievement. How come they didn't score in that first half then, Johnny? Because they had 3 or 4 chances, and it seemed like they were almost as well nervous throughout that first half. Something clicked in the second half, but in the first half, I think they didn't want to lose either.
Yeah, it was a really hot night. It's something called the Föhn, they call it. It comes off the Alps and it sort of really affects that part of Bavaria, Munich. It was a very, very hot evening, end of May, as you said. So it wasn't the conditions that they were used to playing in Britain. The grass was a bit long. It was a bit like what people say about Wembley, finals, the grass strains through the size of the pitch. They all talk about it, the players, that they felt the weight of the occasion. They were suddenly realised they were in a European Cup final, and even then the European Cup final used to get hundreds of millions of television viewers across the world. So they were aware of that, you know what I mean? And like I said, this was a team and a club that had been in the English second division just 3-4 years before. So I think all that came together. It was very interesting you were talking about the crowds Malmo had then compared to now. Malmo are a massive club now. They get tens of thousands and they take huge away support. That's what I was saying when I went to watch Hammarby. Then, interestingly enough, there wasn't the culture and tradition of following teams in Europe from Sweden and Germany. In the year after, Hamburg took barely 5,000-10,000. Imagine that now. Hamburg could take 50, 100,000 fans to a final now. But it was the English that travelled then. Forest took tens and tens of thousands. Most of the stadium was full of people from Nottingham who just, caught trains, caught buses. It's a very funny story after. It took them so long to get there. They all missed the parade when they got back to the city, all the fans who were travelling the ground. It had been done, the whole sort of civic reception. So I think the occasion was huge for them. I mean, there's a great shot of Clough at the end when the final whistle goes, he blows his cheeks, doesn't he, to say, they almost got over the line there. You know what I mean? And I think, like we were just talking about earlier on, Tim was saying, the Cologne semi-final felt like the final. It felt like they'd beaten the other best team in the tournament at that point. And then the pressure was on them, really, as the favourites. They weren't favourites when they played against Liverpool in the first leg. Interestingly enough, I found a Shoot magazine. Manager in the first division predicted Liverpool would win that game against Nottingham Forest over 2 legs, but Forest won the game. I mean, Liverpool, we were talking about playing style, were brilliant at that time. They played, quick triangle football. They were brilliant defensively, could fall into shape, but they had pace. They could, Dalglish up front in his pumps, Souness, Clements in goals. They were a fantastic team at that time, Liverpool. Best team in Europe, along with Forest, and playing brilliant football. They beat them over 2 legs. I remember that game. It was one of the few games that was on live on the ITV regions. I think it was only the second half came on in HTV Wales, where I was from. But I remember the game really well. That's the game where Colin Barrett scores the famous second goal. Gary Birtle scored his first goal for Nottingham
No one had
Forest.
heard of him.
No, bought from Long Eaton Town for £2,000 from non-league, and he's still the only player in history to go from being signed by a non-league club and then winning a Champions League final, we call it a European Cup final. It's astonishing signing. He played basically for a provincial team in non-league that just outside Nottingham, and there he is playing in Europe, and he won Young European Footballer of the Year that year. It's a remarkable story.
That's remarkable, but also Trevor Francis playing his first ever European game in a European Cup final was pretty remarkable as well, I thought.
I know. And he had one chance. It's really interesting because I've broken down the goal almost mathematically because I've seen it so many times. But Robertson is double marked also the game quite sensibly by the Man team. They've gone, well, they're going to double up on this guy because everything comes through him. It's the only time he says that he just drops his shoulder and he manages to get past the two defenders and he managed to get the ball in. And he says to me, I didn't look up. I knew they'd be on their bikes. And if you look at it, it's almost like a four-pronged attack. Bowyer arrives at the near post. Woodcock's just inside. Birtles nearly gets it, but he sees it enough. Francis is on the far post. And that's them all knowing each other almost like, connected mentally. They know the ball's going to come in from John Robertson. And then he throws it down, right? And if you watch the goal, it's astonishing. As he kicks the ball, Robertson, he kind of almost like it's done in fractions of a second. And I broke the frame down. And as it hits Francis's head, John Robertson has composed himself again, has his hand on his hip, and he's watching the head in like hundredths of seconds. I don't know how he does it, the balance and everything else. But he's watching the head.
Has he lit up a fag?
Yeah, literally. That's exactly what I was going to say. It's like as if he's got a fag and a pint on. He's got so much time. And I've spoken to him about it, and he laughs and he goes, I can't remember doing it, he said. But yeah, and it's because he's there in the photograph just watching this goal. And it's the most astonishing thing. And
It is a good goal.
It's such a famous goal now in English football history because it's a £1 million man who scores. He wins the European, and he tumbles famously into the shot putters bit of the track, and it's those old European grounds, beautiful with a big, very unlike it was in Britain, with the running track around in the stands stretching off and all that. I believe the stadium is still there, even though Bayern Munich have moved. It's a protected, listed building. The design that was done for the '72 Olympics, I think it was, wasn't it? But it's just everything about that thing is iconic. But like you said, when I made the film, I forgot how boring the match was because for 30, 40 years, all we'd seen is the goal and the shimmering shirt and the European, the beautiful grass and the colour of the film. So, in our mind's eyes, it all became this glorious night in Munich when Forest had won the European Cup under Clough. But like you say, when you watch the match, it was quite a ball fest of two teams who kind of like a battle of attrition, really. Forest trying to break down this very physical, very fit, organised Swedish football team. We're all big men as well,
Yeah, I think with the Swedish, even though, Tim, you were so critical, when I think of that goal, and particularly the way you've described it, Johnny, I think that's what Forest had to do to penetrate this Swedish defence. I didn't even think about the double marking and so on. They weren't bad at holding Forest at bay. They were. It seemed to me like that they were fighting a rearguard action. They could only win out of luck. But for that goal to be the only goal in the match tells you something about these tractor boys from the south of Sweden, I think.
You're trying to big them up. You're doing a rearguard action as organised and disciplined, as dedicated as theirs back in 1979, and I applaud you for it.
Yeah, but look,
you want to go back to Sweden sometime, don't you? That's what you're saying here.
I will quote.
I've got to say just quickly. Sorry to interrupt. Right?
It's okay.
There's a really famous piece of commentary, which I'm sure Tim will remember. If you were in Sweden, you wouldn't have heard it. Barry Davies, they scored the goal, and he says famously, it's great for the film. The £1 million man has done it. But then he famously says, but that's what I've been waiting for Robertson to do. And he says this almost like an exasperated voice, And John Robertson says to me, as if I wasn't, trying to do that all game when I was double marked by these two very, very good Swedish defenders. As if, I've been having a fag at the side of the pitch going, oh, I'll do it now, And it really annoyed him, that piece of commentary. Yeah. Because when we watch him from the side of the pitch, sometimes we can say things and see things. And as fans, I'm not saying it, I'll say something, I'm dreadful for it. And I had a good example for John Robertson is I was sat at a Forest game with him about a year back, and the ball came out for a Forest corner to the centre half who was at the edge of the penalty area. And instead of heading it just off, back into the danger quickly, he headed it up into the air. So I said, as a football fan, what the fuck's he doing? You get it in there. And John Robertson next to me goes to me, no. They could break away. So he's just giving his fullbacks time to drop back. Try heading out, and we can still win it there as well. So we can still win it, but it just gives me. And I was like, of course, they think in a completely different way to me when you've been there and you've been in it, because I wouldn't have thought of that, you know. And so you
Clough was really good like that on TV, although he could be a hard taskmaster. But it's one of my favourite memories is him and Mick Channon together during the 1986 World Cup. Yeah. When Channon was like the voice of the supporter. He was saying, you know, we got to get forward, we got to attack, and Clough was saying, they're trying, and then Channon said, we got to get forward, we got to get attacked. The Brazilians do it, the Russians do it, the Spanish do it, the French do it. Even educated bees do it.
Clearly, from both of you in this podcast, you cannot quote Brian Clough without doing the voice.
You can't do it. You can't. You cannot do it. Young man, you cannot.
You can't do Brian Clough unless you talk like that.
So by the end of this podcast, let's have a Clough off. I'm staying out of it because I can't do it.
No, he wins. He wins easily.
Even with the Welsh accent, are you having a laugh, Tim? Come on, bring in your Brazilian. I'm sure you can do something.
Where's Mr. Sheen from? Who did a great Clough in the
he's from
United.
Of course,
he's a Welshie.
Yeah,
he did a great job. Do you know, he gave John Robertson a piece of advice. He said to John Robertson, he said to him, what I want you to do, young man, fatty, is I want you to get on the sidelines, he said to him, and I want you to face the pitch from the side. And so Robert was like, what? He said, I don't want you to look that way or that way. I want you to look from the side.
Brilliant.
And Robert went, all right. And he said, I did it, and it completely changed the way I played because I could see where the ball was coming.
The whole panorama. Yeah.
Unbelievable. One piece of advice. And then Colin Barrett says another brilliant one. He says, I come from Manchester City. He said, I've had some great coaches there, Malcolm Allison. You know, he said, I've been there with the best. And he said, the first day I'm training, he's full-back, little five-a-sides. And he said, all I can hear is, pass it forward, Colin. It's got to go forward. Colin, forward. Not sideways, it's got to go forward. And he says, by the end of it, I'm thinking, fucking hell. So he says, I don't say anything because I'm Brian Clough. So he said, you don't answer him back. But I turn to Frank Clark and I say to Frank Clark, and I'll try and do Frank Clark. So I get, and Colin, some man, he goes, what's all that about? What's all that about? And he said, and Frank Clark, he says, well, he says, what he reckons? What he reckons, the gaffer, like. And it's brilliant. He says, if you lose the ball, passing it forward, you haven't got a fucking chase back after it, have you? And Colin said, I went, that's genius. I'd never heard that before. But Clough was obsessed with passing the ball forward. And in the modern game, where we all talk about the ball going sideways a lot, Clough was having none of it. He was saying to them, I would rather you lose the ball, passing it forward, being brave, taking a chance, than pass it sideways. He'd fine centre-halves for passing it sideways to their full-back. Imagine that now. With Barcelona, Clough would fucking fine them. They'd come in half-time, he'd go, I'm fining you. And they go, why? You passed it sideways. And he'd fine them 20 quid. So, you know, he had a really progressive way in the modern game of telling his team what to do. And what they all say was, he spoke very, very little at halftime and before the match, which really surprised me. They went, no, he wouldn't go on. He'd give you one or maybe two of the most very succinct pieces of advice. They said, and he communicated what he wanted brilliantly, but it was one thing. Watch him, you know, on the channel. Watch the forward. He'll stick the ball behind, and that was it. And he never deviated from that. And I was like, wow. And they were like, yeah, he was obsessed with decluttering you before a game, and you just go on there and play football. Amazing.
Simplified everything.
Absolutely.
Even the way that he constructs his team, you know, goalkeeper, centre half, centre forward. He just makes everything simple. I wonder, and this is my question to you, whether he could have had success in the modern game or whether he could have had success outside of the provincial places that he had his success.
England manager.
Well, yeah, in part this is based on Martin O'Neill.
Yeah.
Who, you know, Martin O'Neill went through the academy according to Clough.
He did, yeah.
And during his coaching career, there were times when he just tried to do absolutely by the letter things that Clough did. I spoke to Juninho, the Middlesbrough Juninho, about Martin O'Neill, because they worked together at Celtic, and it didn't work at all. They didn't get on at all. And Juninho was quite disparaging about him doing Clough things.
Yes.
He would, O'Neill would disappear for 3 days and then arrive in a dressing room 10 minutes before the match and say that one thing, And Juninho would shrug and just say, that was like the 70s and the 80s. Not now. So do you think that he could have been successful now? And do you think he could have been successful outside these Midlands towns? Could he have done it in a London club? Could he have done it United? Could he have done it with the England job?
I think so, absolutely. My reason for this is this. It's a bit. You were absolutely right when you were saying earlier on about Peter Taylor, because he was obsessed with recruitment. He was obsessed with recruitment over everything else, over tactics, over man management, over psychology. It was all about recruitment. And he understood, fundamentally, you've got to have good players to have a good football team. And I got that perfectly with him. He was like, you can be the best coach in the world. It's like an actor. You can be the best actor in the world. If you haven't got the script, if you haven't got the players, you can't do it. And his recruitment, when he was at his best, was absolutely perfect. As you said, you got Larry Lloyd at centre half, but you got Kenny Burns, who was more mobile to play next to him. Do you know what I mean? He got the right players in. He had Viv Anderson on one full-back, who was, could be one of the best full-backs in the world. We got John McGovern in, who a lot of people didn't see. So I think that what Clough understood, and he talks about that great line, tactics, a lot of nonsense talking about tactics. It's like he understood the fundamental basis of football is you've got to have great players, and you've got to have your players fit, as Liverpool are discovering this season. And he understood that, and I think that's why he would have worked in the modern game, because wherever he'd have gone, he'd have tried to get the best players he possibly could have had into the football club. Now, I'm not arguing that a manager can't have a profound effect, because we've seen it at Chelsea now, same set of players, and suddenly Chelsea have won 5 games out of 7 and just beaten Atletico Madrid last night. But I think Clough understood that. I think he understood that it was about football players over everything else.
Incidentally, Viv Anderson has been at my gaff, in fact, in this very room that I'm recording from, and he was a complete gentleman, may I say, and he talked about the glory days.
He had never heard of your wife.
That's true. You remember very well. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, you see, let's get into the music.
He was into
then.
like Pink Floyd and stuff, or
well, he wouldn't have liked the charts. He wouldn't have liked the charts in this week. And just before I say that, Johnny, the one thing he talked about was those glory days, and we're literally talking about 40 years ago now.
Yeah,
that must hang like something of a millstone over the necks or heads, whatever it is, of the current day Nottingham Forest players. Can the club ever get back, first of all, to the Premier League? Must be the first ambition, and be the club that they were in the late 70s and 80s. How long will it take for them to achieve that?
Well, they've been over the top flight for over 20 years, which is way too long for Nottingham Forest. You're absolutely right, though. The history is an enormous thing, because they're a massive football club. And you do notice that you get nearly 30,000 every home game. And like I said, they've been out the top flight for 20 years. Their fan base is worldwide. You realise that when you go there. And this is all the legacy of the great team in the late 70s and a great team in the late 80s. Another great side by Clough that rose up. So you get it. There's an amazing thing I found out. About 3 weeks before Leicester won the title, Trinity Mirror won all the regional newspapers, Leicester Mercury, the Nottingham Post. Forest either drew or lost that night to Barnsley. And the guys in London were saying they were getting more traffic from across the world for Forest than Leicester, even at that point, because Forest were double European Cup winners and had this worldwide fan base. Leeds have got, very similar thing, I think, where it's the legacy of that. It can be a millstone. There's no two ways about it. They should be back in the Premier. I think they will get there at some point. But I think, there's never been, we've seen it at Manchester United now, haven't we, with Sir Alex Ferguson. It's difficult when a big name or a big personality and character leaves a football club. It's just, there's always a bit of a transition, which was, remarkable. And Liverpool, when Shankly went, and they kept it going with Paisley. Forest have definitely suffered a little bit with having one of the greatest managers in his prime in English football history. How do you how do you match that after he's gone?
And suffered for keeping him too long. When
Yeah,
he was not in a
definitely.
fit state. And the end is just tragic. And some of the stories about Clough at the end are just they break your heart, you know. And you're thinking,
it's Shakespearean almost, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
almost
it
got
is,
more of a sort of. It's like Sir Alex Ferguson left at the top. It was beautiful, but Clough, those images of him when they get relegated and he's standing in front of the Trent End and thousands of fans are singing Brian Clough is a football genius. Not just Forest fans, but Sheffield United fans as well, and people crying. It's like some kind of Hollywood script. You know what I mean? But like
we have a Shakespearean expert with us today, Johnny.
Yes.
So
yes.
Dotun will now tell us which Shakespearean character he is.
Brian Clough.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. I'm tempted to say Brian Clough is King Lear, only because King Lear has this. First of all, he has children, daughters, who he plays games with and perhaps speaks in that very same Brian Clough accent with, but he does love them. He does love them. It's kind of a strange love, strange relationship with them, and he brings out the best, certainly in his youngest daughter, if not in all
Cordelia,
the
Cordelia, get
yeah,
the
that's
ball.
the one. That's the one. That's the one. Well done, you. So I'll go for King Lear for now. I might have to change that. I'll reflect on it and change it. But what I was going to say, Johnny, in this period of Nottingham Forest being out of the top flight, I don't expect you to say this. I don't expect you to say this. You're communications director at Nottingham Forest. I wouldn't expect you to say this, but as an onlooker, and Nottingham Forest was one of my favourite clubs at the time because, we were teenagers at this point when they're doing so well. And Trevor Francis, one of my favourite players of all time. But the real demise of Nottingham Forest, as much as getting the right players in and having the right personnel, as you put it earlier on, they made a mistake with Pierre van Hooijdonk, and that is what led to them being relegated. And they haven't been able to come. I don't think they'd have been relegated that season, even though they were struggling. I don't think they would have been relegated that season.
He sold Teddy Sheringham at the start of the year. That was a.
That's a good point.
It was madness. What on earth he was doing, letting Sheringham go? Well,
having said that, I think that wasn't a bad idea at all. And that shows the strength that they could have relied on. But let's leave that to one side. The Pierre van Hooijdonk thing was just an absolute mess. And how on earth Nottingham Forest could not convince this player to play for them? I just couldn't understand that.
It was the first real players' strike. I think they'd sold Kevin Campbell, wouldn't they, at the time, and that's what annoyed Pierre. So he decided to go on strike. It was the first time I can remember that happening with a player when I'm not playing anymore. It would have been unthinkable, wouldn't it, when we were growing up, a player to go, I don't want to play for you. You'd be like, what are you talking about? But yeah, that was the start, and they had a terrible season that season, and then they went down, and they actually went down. I think they're the only team that's won a European Cup to play in the third tier of their domestic league, and again getting huge crowds and all that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean? But and then they've come back up. And like I said, it's a process really to build, and the disparity now between 20 years out of the top flight and the money that can generate in a football club is part of it really. Do you know what I mean? And
is Leicester's success though a possible roadmap? The way that Leicester bounced back, is that a possible roadmap?
I think so. I think Leicester have done a lot of things right. They were very lucky in the sense Leicester were the last team not to have a points deduction. Do you remember? And those kind of things, which would have maybe made it more difficult for them. So they kind of, but they've done things really well. I think they've got a very good owner, very progressive. They've got the new stadium, they've got the new, brand new training ground. A lot of things they've done. Sort of the framework is there, isn't it? Really, do you know what I mean? To sort of to show a roadmap of what can be done. But Derby, Derby have got new ground, spent a lot of money. Got very, very benevolent owner, but I haven't made it out. The Championship is a tough league, lads, as well. So last night I was in Rotherham with Forest, and Rotherham fought. Forest won 1-0, but they fought every step of the way, right to the very end. And it's like you do think to yourself, the English domestic league.
It's hard.
You don't go to Yorkshire.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It's
if
extraordinary.
I can just place this in the context of the city of Nottingham.
Yeah.
It was the city of lace when it was making lace, and hence the band Paper Lace. Who are local lads.
I didn't know that. Is that so? Wow, Paper Lace. Yeah. They were terrible, weren't they? They were terrible.
Well, they did the Forest cut records, I think. You know,
got the whole world in our hands, mate.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I have to say they were terrible. In fact, if we look at the charts, that Viv Anderson isn't going to like, there is a kind of a Paper Lays type, well, a couple of Paper Lays type bands in the charts as we speak as well. And I won't mention Bodiam yet. But should we start with... have you had a look at the charts, by the way, Johnny? Have you had a look at the?
I had a look at that year,
yeah. Because you're a little boy at that point. But imagine me leading the flag, flying the flag for music in Sweden, UK music, punk rock, etc. And who do I see at number one? Blondie. Brilliant song, would you not say? Is everybody in agreement with that?
Yeah, it's a kind of bubblegum pop phase, isn't it, Sunday Girl?
Well, remember, they were always supported by the punks because they kind of came out of a... They were never really punk. They were more kind of new wavy, but they sat well with the punks. But the great harmonies is what they do, great melodies. I don't think you can get away without singing Sunday Girl along the way. And Johnny, you're a broadcaster, you know music. What do you make of that? Would you go for Sunday Girl or Dance Away? Dance Away by Roxy Music's number 2, though. If you had to, John Robertson's
favourite band, Roxy Music. It was an interesting time when I did the doc, actually, because I couldn't quite work it in there as much as I would have. But obviously, Thatcher gets elected earlier that month, which was the big change in British. Certainly,
I was going to ask you about the lace industry and the industrialisation, and whether there are things to do in Nottingham. There was a link there.
It was it's the lace industry, the bike. They were famous for making rally bikes. The mining industry that existed, but all gone now. All gone. Yeah. Nottingham is a kind of like a lot of Western European cities, all about the universities and research and all those kind of things. They are the kind of big employers in Nottingham now. But that's what I wanted to do in the film. And I spoke to a guy who was brilliant, actually. He'd done his thesis on the effect that Nottingham Forest Football Club had on the city at that time. And he'd done this big research into how there was better production in the factories and all sorts because people felt better, he said, because their team was winning. He'd done all this really complex research. It was fascinating. And he was going, this is how important football can be. And this is the effect it can have on a city. And this is the effect one man coming in like Brian Clough can have on a whole economy. And I was like fascinated by that. And the reason why I picked a lot of disco music, and I picked the Jackson Sisters and the songs I Believe in Miracles. There's a good musical debate as to whether it was the first disco song of all time. It was a debate between that and The Love I Lost by Harry Melvin and the Blue Tones. That was the big debate.
Blue Notes.
Okay.
Yeah, Blue Notes, yeah. So I was a bit like, that's why I topped the tail of the film with that. And the reason why I picked disco music was I didn't realise how well it was going to work with John Robertson's big arse on a mud pitch taking on a player. When I played disco music, it just seemed to suit it so well. Bovril and fences and all that. But this music, and I think the music of the time was interesting because by 79, there was the disco backlash. I believe that was the year the disco sucks sort of thing. But what I loved was that because disco music, I'm a huge fan of disco music now. And I think a lot of people are now much more receptive to disco music, a bit like ABBA. They've aged well, really, do you know what I mean, with time. And Blondie. Blondie was slated a lot by a very snobby British press, the time. The Enemy used to really hammer them. She talks about this, doesn't she, Debbie Harry? They're quite sneering about them as being, not true punks. But what's happened is Blondie, to me, and disco, and those have aged really well. So you listen to them and you go, that sounds great, strings and all that. And the journey of disco. Because like when I first went to disco as a kid, my uncle worked as a barman, and I went into a discotheque, as they call them, in the late 70s. I was only a kid. And it had like fucking palm trees and the deco was like, I was like, this is in Merthyr Tydfil. I was like, this is like
the silver ball hanging from the ceiling. Yeah, of course.
It felt like this magic carpet ride in another place.
It was magical.
It was
magical. That's the word.
Do you know the discotheques of those days were the equivalent of what they used to call picture palaces in the 1930s. So cinemas grew out of this, selling this dream of you can sit in this luxurious surrounding, even though it's the times of the Depression. And remember, we had something of a depression, certainly downturn the economy throughout the 70s. Discotheques was a way that you could get away from it all, the drudgery of your 9 to 5, as was excellently displayed in the movie Saturday Night Fever.
Great film.
But isn't there's something fascinating here because we're also in the chic era.
Yeah.
And like, we Are Family, the Sister Sledge project is climbing up the charts then. And Chic, first of all, Niall has seen Roxy Music and thinks, well, we can do a kind of black version of that.
Yes,
but
you're
Chic
right.
is also really self-consciously a product to the stratification in the black community post the civil rights era. Because remember the double-breasted business suits,
it's aspirational.
The Chic Corporation.
Yeah,
that's what they called themselves, and they were like faceless business people, which isn't Nile Rodgers at all. But that's the way that which was hugely influential.
Yes,
that's the way that was being sold to people.
Yeah,
I've interviewed. Sorry, go on, Johnny.
I'm Nottingham plugged. So Nottingham had this reputation. I don't know if you both know this, but because of the lace industry, the cliche was there was lots of women in the city, so 5 girls to every bloke.
There are. That's Nottingham. That's why everybody wanted to go to Nottingham University. Honestly, genuinely, in my day.
So Clough used to get players like that. Clough used to get players. He used to say to the young players, about Nottingham, young man, you can come here. And he used to say that to them. So it was like just selling point. And it had a great nightclub. Larry Lloyd, I arrived there, he said in Liverpool, bless it, was just starting to really turn economically, bless it. It was but he said Nottingham just felt, wow, it's much more of a city with a lot of money flying around, and the discos and, all this kind of stuff. And it all coordinated, really. And that's why I felt that worked so well with those few years.
I couldn't wait to get to Nottingham. I went to Nottingham first of all with the sound system. I think we were playing against Rocket. Rocket was the Nottingham sound system, the big Nottingham sound system of the day, as I recall. But I couldn't wait to get to Nottingham because I'd heard about 4 girls to every bloke. It didn't work for me. Exactly, that was my thinking. Didn't work for me, by the way. I'm just letting you know. Didn't work.
I've only been once. I saw the Style Council there, I think in '85 at the Royal Centre. And I got straight. I had to stay the night there, so I stayed the night in a service cafe or something like that. I wasn't being attacked by 5 women, so
it's like when I went to Greece once. I bumped into this sort of like policeman in Piraeus, in the dock area of Athens, and he says to me, and I said, which of the islands should I go to? He said, hey man, he speaks in an American accent because he's lived in the States. He said, hey man, you got to go to Santorini. They call it the Island of Love. Did you see the movie The Island of Love? It was made there. I went to Santorini faster than the ferry could take me, and I didn't find any love there. So just be kids, don't listen to the hype. Don't believe it. But as it's paper lace and it's lace in Nottingham, we have to say hello, baby. Ba 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 ba. Yeah, this is the Big Bopper speaking. Ba 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 ba. Do I what? Will I what? Oh, baby, you know what I like. Chantilly lace and a pretty face and a ponytail hanging down, a wiggle in a walk and a giggle in a talk. That's Nottingham for you, all the way there.
Johnny, he will get the Big Bopper. He died in 1959. It's at every podcast we do, irrespective of era. He will find a way to shoehorn the substantial frame of the Big Bopper into the conversation.
He wasn't as big as that, When I compare him to me, I think, hang on, he was quite slimlined. That's another story. But it is an important time for disco here.
Yeah. Ring My Bell.
79.
Climbing the charts. Oh, Syndromes.
Yeah. Oh, that is arguably the most iconic of the disco tracks in the charts.
So I was just starting going to the youth club disco, and I can still see the lights. Yeah, and it transports me back to this world that's playing Ring My Bell, and it's playing Now That We've Found Love by Third World. What are we going to do with it?
Yeah, indeed.
All of those memories of this time are so
Don't forget, Ain't No Stopping Us Now, McFadden and Whitehead as well.
That's one of the 2 anthems, isn't it? The other is Funkadelic, One Nation Under a Groove, and McFadden and Whitehead. I remember meeting northern people when I went to college, and they never heard of either of them. And I think, what the fuck is the matter with you? How can you not know these 2 songs? These are the anthems.
Yeah. You're right, though. And do you know what is tied in, though? You're right, that music at the time, the Adidas red silk shirt of that final, it all felt like late set. That's what I felt, and I was like, I remembered all that. And £1 million, the glamour of Trevor Francis being £1 million player, and Clough, when he was on the telly, my old man going, shh, shh, you know, he's going to say something. He was a superstar, you know. He was like one of the most famous men in Britain, you know, and all that. Like I said, you're back in your childhood again. Like I said, you're back to the Silver Ball in the local disco and all that as a youth club, and those songs are playing. And you know, that's why I wanted to play it. And I picked a song in their Boogie Wonderland, which was written by a guy from Cleethorpes.
Oh,
Rob Templeton. You know what I mean?
It's one of Rob Templeton's.
Who wrote Thriller with Michael Jackson. You know what I mean? And I was a bit like, well, you know, what's that about? What a beautiful combination that is, you know?
Of course, because what was the band that he played with?
Heatwave.
Heatwave. It was Heatwave, wasn't it? Yeah,
great
of course.
band.
Yeah, who were in the charts as well. That one that didn't do a lot, Razzle Dazzle, but it's a great song.
Yeah.
But there are other things happening as well. I mean, one thing that's climbing up the charts at this moment is Our Friends Electric.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, well, not for me, but really, really influential.
For me, it's brilliant because there are two David Bowie connections in this charts. I think that is clearly the one that has been influenced entirely by David Bowie. But funnily enough, I think Roxy Music has been influenced by David Bowie as well.
Just so we can moan about Gary Newman a little bit more. I've always seen Cars as the Thatcherite record.
Yeah. You see, don't read too much into the themes of the song, please. Otherwise, you're going to get a few dodos in this one as well, in these charts, because it gets worse. I'd be surprisingly good for you, Linda Lewis. I don't know what she's doing there, trying to sing like Shirley Bassey. And she's a really great gal, you know. She's absolutely bonkers. And I say that in a very affectionate way, but she's eccentric. Let me put it that way. She's very, very Cockney. And growing up as a black kid in London, this was one of the first superstars that were black British to us, you know, so she does deserve her place in the history. But at this point, she's lost her mojo and she's gone off on a kind of a, Shirley Bassey, whatever it is. I don't know what she's doing there, which is such a shame. But disco is being popified here. I think this is a beginning, or at least this is emblematic of how disco lost its way, because my disco era would have been 5 years before. So I'd have only been about 14 or 15, but we were going into sort of discos for 18-year-olds at that time with a little bit of boot polish above our upper lip, a black boot polish, obviously, in my case. But that was the era for me, Hamilton Bohannon and all these...
I'd like to know where you got the notion.
He does this all the time. Don't worry, John. He will always slip in a line that I have to pick up on, just to show that I'm not just a fan of Joan
Jett. Keep staying alive, haven't he, with the disco theme? That's the thing.
Staying alive, indeed. But I think a lot of the stuff is getting popified, and that's why you're getting groups like Boney M coming into the charts. And did you hear that?
But the German stuff, isn't it?
Exactly. That is the problem. It is the German. 100%.
Germans.
Honestly, they're the ones. They Europeanized our disco music to a certain extent that it kills the whole thing in a few years.
Because it becomes music for people with dance music for people with no sense of rhythm. Bang, 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 bang.
Anybody can dance to this.
Although
as the hi-hat, it's harder to dance to, Motown and all that. I mean, you've got to have a bit of groove about you, whereas diddle, 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 but anybody can dance. George Moroder.
The one exception I would say is Hot Stuff by Donna Summer that comes from that Georgia Moroder school. Somehow it seems to stay in the right side of, you know, artistic, positivity. But Boney M's Hooray, Hooray, It's a Holly Holiday. And that leads on to other, because it's not the only one that's Hooray, Hooray, It's a Positive Holiday or whatever it is.
There's Eruption are there with One Way Ticket. Amy Stewart with Knock on Wood.
No, she's at least a decent singer, Amy Stewart.
But it is the German model of bang, bang, bang.
Well,
bang,
the
bang.
worst one is Linda Clifford with Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Did you hear that?
No.
Oh my word. Oh my word. I don't know where Simon and Garfunkel were. Well, Art Garfunkel's going up the charts. He's going to get to number one with Bright Eyes. Not the same thing. But honestly, listen to Bridge Over Troubled Water by Linda Clifford and you will want to throw a brick at your TV screen or whatever it is that you listen to it from. She completely destroys what is perhaps one of the greatest songs, positive songs in pop history. But we have to give a big shout out to The Clash, the Cost of Living EP. Thank you very much to Joe Strummer and them lot, because until that Cost of Living EP, you could only get Capital Radio if you were lucky to have got it as an extra 7-inch in the first copies of some album, I think maybe their second album.
They'd already lost quite a lot of their audience, hadn't they?
You reckon? I think they've moved on. I don't think they've lost their
Well, they've
audience.
moved on because they were chasing the international dream. They took it all over.
Yeah.
Remember, this is the year.
Especially, yeah.
This is the year that the Jam are just about to absolutely explode.
Yeah, strange time when that's happening. But now
and then the one that really makes them a big act is Eton Rifles.
Yes,
yeah,
that gets number 3, doesn't it? So that's like top 5. That's massive.
So they're just about to steal all the Clash audience.
Yeah. And they
give them enough rope. Is that the second album? Give enough rope.
I think it is. Yeah.
Which is a fucking great. I mean, have you listened to Safe European Homes?
That's the best. That's the best track on the album.
I live in Brazil. I love Safe European Home.
Yeah,
I think about it all the time.
That is the best. And I remember I was living in Sweden when it came out. I was still in Sweden at that time, and I remember we used to go around to my mate's house on a Friday night and play all the latest singles and albums and everything like that. We rinsed that one out, and they could get it in Europe. I mean, Tim's right, because at this point, the Clash are doing what the Stranglers did to a certain extent, which is like make their music understandable rather than palatable, because people were buying records left, right and centre in those punk days, but understandable to a wider audience. So Safe European Home resonated with everybody at my friend Sven's house that Friday night before we went out to a party, or his flat, his studio flat as it was in those days that most people lived in Stockholm, that we packed out and rinsed out the tunes. But I think Safe European Home is kind of the Clash from the Complete Control era. They've got the sort of sound that Lee Perry gave them, the sort of wall of sound that he gave them, rather than the sort of like sparsy kind of reggae dub thing that they were doing at the time, that the Police are very much doing with Roxanne, that's in the charts at this time as well. I think Safe European Home is probably amongst their top 3 or 4 tunes for me, to be honest. Yeah.
It's interesting you should say this, because Lydon talks about this, doesn't he? He says, because if we're talking about 79 now, he says by 78 what the Pistols had done, really. A lot of people say the Pistols done by late 77. But he says that the Clash were interested, as you said, in world domination, whereas he said we weren't. The nihilist, I know, the year zero punk philosophy is taken it to the extreme. But he did say they were interested. They had much more ambition than us to be commercially successful. That's what Lydon says.
Well, I think they had to because of the record deal as well. You know.
Well, I think they. I think they made more about that record deal than was actually true, you know. I mean, they said they were signed to CBS for a 7-album deal, and they were trying to put out double albums and triple albums to fulfill that. And then suddenly they realized, oh, the double album and triple album doesn't actually count as 3 albums and 2 albums. I think they made too much of that, you know. I think they had a lot of material. They were, their muse was running overtime, both Mick Jones and Joe Strummer's muse. And by the way, this is the time, or maybe a year later, that the Clash put me on stage at the Ice Stadium in Stockholm. So I'm very grateful to them for that. But I remember Cosmo Vinyl.
I get to mention every week as well, even more than the big.
I haven't mentioned that. I didn't mention it last week. I didn't mention it last week, Tim, so don't exaggerate now. But can I start that again? When the Clash put me on stage in 1980 at the Ice Stadium in Stockholm, Cosmo Vinyl was their manager. Now, this is a crucial point, though. Cosmo Vinyl was their manager at the time. Well, at least he was their tour manager. And he certainly saw the benefit of having a lot of music pushed out into the various corners of the world. They dominated Europe. That Ice Stadium might have had 20,000 people in there. So, Tim, just to reiterate, I was performing in front of 20,000 people as a support band to the Clash. 20,000 people in there.
See, I think it was 19,999. I've always thought it was exaggerated.
The point was they could have sold twice as many tickets. Anyway, lots of fun. I'll tell you what was in the news at the time, of course, was this
just a minute here. I'm going to have to go.
I know. This is the last thing. Right. Puppet regime in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia. Ian Smith not looking very happy. And, of course, that will unravel in the coming weeks and months. It won't last very long, will it?
And I think Iran was this year as well. It was Carter really lost it with Iran, and then this was the start of Reagan would arrive the following year. So this is a real era change in world geopolitics, because Thatcher's arrived now, Reagan's about to arrive. It's the end of disco. That, you know, the 70s, it's done really, as tends to happen when you come to the end of the decade, I know, but it does feel like everything's sort of wrapping itself up really.
Johnny, cannot thank you enough for being with us.
There's a horrendous lie here. And people talk about the new right going for the big lies now.
Yeah.
But I was there. I remember it. That election poster from the Tories.
I know Labour
isn't working.
I know.
It was a double-edged
effective.
thing. It was, the Labour government isn't functioning, but also there's a lot of unemployment, and it was a line of supposedly unemployed people. It was in fact a line of young Conservatives, and this was from a government who knew that they were going to break trade union power, and the way that they were going to do that was to create a depression. It ended up being more severe than they expected. But they knew, they took power with this Labour isn't working.
Yeah, they did.
Knowing that they were going to put people out of work.
It was effective.
A huge lie, and it was effective. It worked.
Saatchi.
That's right.
And just a final note, Brian Clough, very much a lefty, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He used to tell his players, you better vote Labour, otherwise I'll put him on the transfer list.
Johnny, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Very well. Really enjoyed it.
And welcome back anytime.
Oh, I'd love to come back. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, lads.